Another restless night. These were quite common for me now after long days of surgery. Sometimes my hands wouldn't stop shaking from all the stress and fatigue of using them all day, gripping a scalpel and having to be exact, precise so I don't kill anyone. I would never say I didn't enjoy the work. I loved it. I didn't enjoy staying up late at night though. It was the middle of my next rotation and I was only halfway through. I was relieved for a 4-hour break during the slowest time of the night, and allowed a brief reprieve before my next 16-hour shift. Another 48 hours of this to go, not counting the breaks that I would get. I loudly sighed as I continued to stare at the ceiling, wondering if this was it. Was this my whole existence? What I was expected to do for the rest of my life? And periods of busy work followed by rest periods with nothing else to fill the void. I was tired of thinking like this, just lying in bed, wallowing. I groaned as I stood up. My hands were not the only exhausted part of me. As I shuffled toward the window, I could see a small beacon of light peeking through, staining the floor from the streetlights outside. I moved the curtain aside enough to see the surrounding streets. It was often empty at this time, but it seemed even more so this time. As I glanced around, trying to find something to keep my mind busy, I could see that one of the streetlights was out. Strange. The city was usually on top of this. As I continued to stare at the dark patch of sidewalk, a small white figure slowly materialized, a stark contrast against the dark sidewalk. The white figure was lying on the ground, a pool of pale liquid spreading outward from it. I rubbed my eyes hard, thinking that I had imagined things. Was that a person? It was hard to tell in the darkness. I continued to stare as the pool grew more prominent, spreading out to the edge of the darkness under the streetlight. It stopped just before it reached the light of another lamp. However, I decided to act. I had an oath to do so, and whoever this was seemed injured. Invigorated by what I had seen, I had more than enough energy to throw on a robe and grab a nearby medical kit. I always kept one on hand for emergencies. When I arrived downstairs, the streetlights were blinding, much brighter once below them. As my eyes adjusted, I could not see any figures in the darkness ahead. I shook my head and pushed onward toward the dark patch of street. It was likely just due to my eyes adjusting to the light. I just needed to pull whoever it was into the light and I would be able to help. As I stepped onto the dark patch of the sidewalk, I felt a lump settle in the bottom of my stomach. I was overcome with nausea as I realized that I had not stepped onto the sidewalk, and I was instead falling forward into the darkness. I yelped and moved my hands to brace my fall, expecting to feel the hard, cold cement, but instead felt nothing. I tumbled forward and began to spiral downward into darkness, spinning faster and faster as my surroundings were intertwined entirely with pure black. I could see nothing. The wind was knocked out of me as I landed on the ground, and I struggled to catch my next breath. It took a couple of moments for my eyes to adjust, but I felt them widening at my surroundings as they did. I sat up and glanced around, trying to understand what I was seeing. The ground was Prussian blue, with dark tendril-like fingers spread across every surface, almost like black vines and moss. I could only see a couple of feet forward into the darkness before my vision died off. On the ground in front of me was a white trail of liquid smeared across the floor. Tufts of tendrils ripped through and pulled apart. I reached over to my medical kit and was able to find some gloves. As I snapped them on, I touched one finger down into the liquid and dabbed some on the tip. I held it away from my nose and sniffed lightly. It smelled strongly of garbage, laced with a sickeningly sweet smell that I could not identify. I wiped my finger on the ground and kept my gloves on, standing up slowly. As I stood to my feet, I felt my breath rasping in my chest. The fall had hurt me worse than I had thought. I glanced up above me and only saw darkness. As I sighed, I realized there was only one way to go. I started to follow the trail forward into the darkness. As I progressed, my vision seemed to adapt to see further, but my surroundings did not change. Before long, I realized that the road ahead was widening, an entryway into a large alcove. I stopped at the entrance to the space and stared ahead, my heart starting to beat faster in my chest. The trail of white liquid stopped at the edge of a raised part of the ground. Laying on the floor on top was a completely black creature, a dark void barely visible in the room. It lifted its head and looked at me, black eyes seeming to pierce through me. I could see that its face was vaguely humanoid in shape, but that was the only resemblance to myself. The creature had a large body with multiple limbs jutting out at random angles from the neck down. The limbs were covered with black tendrils, matted with liquid that something had smeared over the creature's limbs. It opened its mouth, and a loud shriek emitted, echoing through the cavern and rocking my entire body. And before I could stop myself, I was walking toward the creature. As I got closer, I could see that the beast had smeared the white liquid all over its face. It didn't have much time to think as it jutted out one of its limbs in front of me. I could see that there was a large tear down on the segment, a white ooze leaking out slowly. The creature stared at me as I looked at the limb and seemed to nod its head at my bag and then back at the leg. My arms were shaking as I sat on the bag. Did this thing want me to fix its leg? I didn't know anything about this thing. What if I made the wound worse? The creature seemed to notice my hesitation and shrieked loudly once again. I covered my ears with my hands as I stared at the beast in front of me. This time, I saw that its mouth was full of razor-sharp teeth. As the shrieking died down, I tried to slow my breathing. Think like I am in surgery, just to concentrate on the task ahead of me. I was able to calm down some and grab the leg to look at the wound. It was a long tear, but not so vast that I couldn't force the edges back together. I grabbed the suture kit from the bag and started work on the wound, slowly closing in the smaller edges before working across the more significant parts of the tear. This wasn't as easy on my own. Usually, an assistant would keep everything close together and neat. I doubt the creature cared if it had a scar though. I forced the edge of the skin together as closely as I could. It felt like I was pulling rugged leather against a team of strongmen, trying to win some twisted tug-of-war. I was able to muscle the skin forward and pull these sutures through eventually. The wound seemed to be closed off, and I could see none of the strange liquid seeping out. The creature lifted its limb upward and moved it slowly before pulling it in closer to its body. As I started to pack up, I wondered just what this thing was, why it had called me here. I heard a slow hissing sound growing in volume from in front of me. I glanced up as I finished packing and saw that it was staring directly at me, its head cocked to the side. Before I could move, two of its limbs jutted forward and grabbed both of my arms, holding them tight to my body. I could see that its mouth was opening wide as I struggled to free myself. Without warning, it bit down onto my neck, ripping a large chunk out of my shoulder. I screamed as hot blood sprayed outward, coating the creature in front of me. As I continued to scream in pain, it moved to more of its limbs forward, grabbing me on both sides of the fresh wound. I could hear a sickening crunch fill my ears as my screams grew even louder. I glanced down to the left, trying to see between my squinted eyes as it tore off my entire left side, ripping my body in half. It dropped me to the ground, and I fell onto my back, blood pouring out on my left side. As I glanced upward, the creature slowly forced my left arm down its throat. Its body was bulging outward as it shoved the meat that was mine deeper inside. I blacked out from the pain before I could see anymore. Even though I had shut my eyes, the sun still burned them. I suddenly sat up screaming. As I opened my eyes, I could see stunned people standing nearby on the sidewalk. They quickly walked in the opposite direction away from me. I immediately looked to the left and started touching my chest and neck. It was completely whole. Nothing was missing, which was some relief at least. I sighed as I glanced around my surroundings. I was outside of my apartment building, but something was wrong. Something seemed off. As I stood up, my body creaked and complained loudly, a consequence of sleeping on the sidewalk. I walked toward my apartment building, slowly trying to catch my bearings. As I got to the front door, I realized that my key was not working. I couldn't get in. That didn't make any sense. Why wouldn't it work? I looked to the side and started pressing call buttons for random apartments in a flurry, sliding my hand up and down. Eventually, one of them buzzed me through when I entered. I just needed to get back to my apartment and get some rest. I don't understand what happened last night, but some sleep would do me good. My whole body was complaining as I climbed the stairs. Why was this so difficult? I knew I was tired, but this was way harder than usual. I finally arrived at the entrance to my apartment. I shoved my key into the door, but it wouldn't turn, no matter how much force I put on it. Why was this so difficult? Did someone take my key while I was asleep? That didn't make any sense. Why would I still have a key then? I was racking my brain, trying to figure out what happened when the door opened. I felt my breath leave me as I tried to figure out what to say. My eyes met the person standing in front of me, and I realized that they looked exactly like me. "Do I know you?" The voice that entered my ears was my own. He sounded confused, but precisely like me. He seemed to stand back farther and cough some, and I realized that I stunk like garbage. My mind was racing. Had the creature somehow replaced me? What was going on? I had no control of my actions as I reached out and grabbed his shirt, pulling him close. "What did you do to me? Who are you? What do you want with me?" His eyes grew wide as I screamed into his face. It was clear he was just as confused as I was. However, his face grew dark as he shoved into my chest hard. I fell backward and down to the ground. "Back off! What the heck is wrong with you? Get out of here before I call the cops." He slammed the door shut on my face. I sat on the ground, my mind foggy. What is going on? What happened to me? I couldn't stand it. My body was shaking too much. The thoughts ravaging my mind were intertwined with increased pain in my body from being knocked back. I slowly crawled down the hallway. I passed by a window as I reached these stairs and saw that I did not look like myself. I was someone else, some older man, crawling on the floor in a dirty bathrobe. The confusion was overwhelming. What was I supposed to do now? I looked like some old man. No one would be able to believe what had happened to me. I didn't even believe what happened to me. Was last night a dream, and was I always an old man? Am I some drugged-out homeless man? I started to climb down the stairs as tears streamed down my face. I was sitting outside on the curb before I realized it, with my head in my hands. I could hear a loud discussion to the side when I finally raised my head. I glanced over and saw a man pointed at me while speaking with the police. My brain clicked on. I could barely understand what was happening, and I didn't need to be involved with the police right now. I slowly rose upward and walked down the street. As I passed a nearby alleyway, I cut down into it. I peered outward onto the road and could see that the police didn't follow. Worked for me. I slid down to the ground and sat against the cold wall shadowed in the alleyway. I was still worn and tired from everything that had happened, and I laid down onto my side. I didn't care that I was lying on garbage-stained asphalt. I just needed some rest. I needed some time to figure out what was going on. My eyes closed slowly as the world faded around me. I awoke to a kick in the stomach. It knocked the wind out of me as I spewed out liquid onto the ground. The air burned my throat as I struggled to take my next breath. Before I could say anything, another kick landed, this time on my chest. I glanced up and saw two figures above me, laughing as I struggled for my next breath. They let me lay there gasping until I had enough breath to move. I started to crawl away, trying to escape from the unknown assailants. I made it as far as the sidewalk before I felt a stomp on my leg behind me. A sickening crunch filled my ears as my ankle broke and I screamed. The laughing behind me continued as I tried to crawl forward, a white liquid painting the sidewalk below. I rolled onto my back, realizing that I could go no further. There was no escape. The sun was starting to set, and the streetlights were slowly whirring to life, all except the one that I was under. I could see the two figures beginning to walk toward me. Both of them had knives in their hands. I closed my eyes to accept my fate when I heard a tiny tink on the concrete nearby, footsteps fleeing in the distance. I slowly sat up and realized the two figures had run away in the opposite direction, one of them dropping a knife. I grabbed it and held it close to my chest. Why had they run away? I heard a loud shriek from behind me and I quickly realized why. I glanced down just as a tendril wrapped its way around my body and legs. I tried to locate the source only to see the tendrils receding into the ground behind me. I didn't have time to think. I clicked out the knife and began to stab at the tendrils, deeply cutting one of them. A white liquid spurted outward and spilled onto the ground. The liquid stank as it spread out to cover most of the concrete surrounding us. The remaining tendrils did not loosen their grip, and they slowly pulled me toward the hole. One of the tendrils rapidly jutted out and wrapped around my hand, squeezing down hard until it forced the knife to fall. As quickly as the blade had bounced away, the tendrils pulled me down into darkness. My eyes tried to adjust as I felt my body dragged along the ground, streams of liquid in front of me as torn vines twisted away. My eyes adjusted and I realized that I was in the large cabin once more, this time supported in the air, suspended above the monster. It was staring at the wound on one of its tendrils, a large tear that was weeping out white liquid. It brought the tendril to its mouth and slowly licked it clean before turning its gaze to me, face now smeared with the juice. The pure black eyes pierced into me as its mouth opened wide, more expansive than it had before. It began to slowly shove me into its mouth, my head entering its throat. I could feel the walls closing down on me as the sliminess coated my face, seeping into my throat. I could barely breathe as the creature shoved me deeper inside. Before long, I could no longer breathe, completely enclosed in the throat of the creature. I tried to struggle free, tried to move, but to no avail. The walls were compressing harder on me, and I started to choke from the pressure. I felt like my eyes were going to pop out as I fell unconscious from lack of oxygen. And then I awoke in my bed. My chest was heaving as I stared around the empty room. As I ripped the covers free, I saw that sweat had drenched my mattress, moisture that had escaped my body. It was night. I ran over to the blinds and ripped them open, staring at the street below. As my eyes darted around wildly, I could see that all the streetlights were on, all of them except for one. Lamps brightly illuminated the road and some people were walking on both sides. Everybody was walking around the shadow of the streetlight, seemingly oblivious that they were naturally avoiding it. I slowly pulled the curtain shut as I went to sit down at the edge of the bed. I was shaking as I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. I found what I was looking for before long. As the phone started to ring, I held it loosely up to my ear, breath still whistling in and out as I tried to calm down. The phone clicked and a polite voice answered on the other side. "Is something wrong, Nolan? You've only been off shift for an hour. Don't be so eager to get back here, okay?" I strained my voice the best I could as I spoke. "I won't be coming into work for a while. I'm sorry, I can't explain." I hung up the phone and threw it to the side. I could hear it rumbling underneath the bed as I laid down on my side and started to cry, tears streaming down my face and staining the hardwood below. I never figured out what happened that night, what I had experienced. The streetlight still hasn't been fixed and it taunts me as I stay up all night, standing at my bedroom window. I don't sleep at night anymore.